Hello again, everybody. Today we're going to talk about infection and process-based flavors. So, less than ideal situations. Most of these flavors, well, maybe not most, but a lot of them are going to be flavors you don't want, flavors you want to be aware of because you want to make sure you know how they occurred, where they came from in your process, and how you want to get rid of it or prevent them in the first place. So processed flavors come from a variety of tasks performed in the brewery. Got a little bug flying around. So we're going to come from water flavors. We're going to talk about water as a raw ingredient, kind of a little out of order. I didn't give water its own lecture just because it's complicated and it doesn't need it, in my opinion, for our needs for this class. So use as a raw material, rinsing equipment, and brewing salts along with water in general. Flavors come from chemical processes as well. Cleaning and sanitizing involve a number of chemicals, usually. Fermentation process and aids. So we're talking about yeast food, temperature differences during fermentation and finings. And then we'll talk about heating methods, the process by which we add heat to our system. So first, water flavors. So water as a raw ingredient is something we think about what makes up the majority of this product right here. This product right here is 95% water. So we need to think about the water that we use to start our product as a raw ingredient. And you should, because it is. It's 95% of your finished product. Think about it. So the things in water that cause flavor, ions or salts of some sort. So sodium produces a flavor, and it's really dependent upon concentration. It can, when it's paired with chloride, by the way, sodium chloride, salt is known as a flavor enhancer until you get too much, and then it's just going to taste salty, like salt water, like the ocean. Below that threshold, it is a flavor enhancer, so it enhances the things that you already have going on. But by itself, sodium by itself, you can get it from other chemicals and other salts. Sodium bicarbonate is our source of sodium here in this brewery. So on levels up to 100 milligrams per liter, so it can produce as a sweetening effect. It's kind of a little different than what you would expect. 150 to 200 contributes that salty taste, and that's going to be usually in combination with the chloride that's there, just because that's really what we're used to as far as sensing a salty flavor. And anything above 250 is going to be harsh, it's going to be sour, it's just not going to be good. You think about if you go to the ocean, get some in your mouth, it tastes awful. At least it does to me. I can't do saltwater gargles either, just can't do it. It's not for me. So magnesium, you might recognize this from magnesium sulfate. It's one of the brewing salts that's used during water chemistry calculations, but it can contribute a bitter or sour flavor. It's not that much of a concern. It's usually just a micronutrient. So pH is a very important one here. So pH basically is the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration, which gives us a measure of how many hydroxyl ions, if you're on the alkaline side, or how many hydrogen ions, if you're on the acidic side, are in concentration. So pH low is going to be acidic, pH high is going to be alkaline. And the flavor contributions are going to be concentration dependent, and it's also going to be dependent upon which acid is contributing the pH changes. So let's say a pH 3.5 beer, which is sour, it's not mouth-puckering sour, but it is sour. It's going to taste different if you get that sourness from phosphoric acid, hydrochloric acid, or if you get it from lactic acid, which if you're making a kettle sour, it's going to be from lactic acid. So they taste different. there's just no other way to describe it than different. Lactic acid sourness is something that you're used to if you have had kettle sours before. You're not really going to see too much on the alkaline side. Beer should be acidic. That's one of the reasons why it is a food-safe product. Usually your finishing pH on a normal beer is in the mid to lower 4s. Anything below that's going to be kind of sour, a little too acidic, unless that's your goal. One of our sours here at Henderson, we had a finishing pH of about 3.1 to 3.2, kind of right in between there, depending on the day that you took the reading with. And that one, that'll tweak your cheeks. It's pretty sour. Iron, you don't really want iron in your beer. It's going to taste like blood. It's going to taste like metal. It's going to taste like you went out and licked a metal pole. It's awful. And really, the source for iron is going to be your source water coming in. Depending on how old of a city where you live, they could possibly still have some iron piping somewhere in the process leading up to your facility. Or it may be your facility that has iron piping. I hope not, but it's possible, and that's where you're picking up iron usually. Chloride, which is the negative salt, it accentuates body and fullness. It really does give that mouthfeel roundness to it. And then sulfate is going to be the ion that accentuates dryness or bitterness. For hoppy beers, you really want a higher sulfate concentration as opposed to chloride. There's a chloride to sulfate ratio that you're going for to help accentuate certain things. For hoppy beers, you really want a higher sulfate to chloride ratio. For beers you want to accentuate the body, you really want to go for a higher chloride to sulfate ratio. The trick is finding a balance. So on New England's, I have seen a 3 to 2 sulfate to chloride ratio. I've also seen a 3 to 2 chloride to sulfate ratio, and it really would just take a little bit of experimenting to see which one will work better for you as far as how you're going to brew your beer. We shoot for a 3 to 2 sulfate to chloride ratio on our New England's. So, rinsing equipment. Let's say you're just finished your caustic CIP and it's time to rinse it. You got to make sure you rinse all that chemical out, number one, because you have to. You just got to rinse it out, otherwise you're going to run into problems. Usually you're not going to have too much of an issue with your rinse water causing flavor impacts on your finished product, unless for some reason you're rinsing after sanitizing, which I don't recommend by any means whatsoever. And then you have areas in your fermenter that are basically shadows and they hold water. I doubt that's going to happen. I doubt that's going to be the case, but just know it's a possibility if you leave rinse water in your fermenter. Anything that's off tasting in your rinse water can come through in your finished product, even though it is probably going to be significantly diluted. So like I said, municipal water supply is where you're going to have a run-in, and really the most significant issue is going to be chlorine that is in the water. And this also goes back to water as a raw ingredient. At a minimum, you should be processing your water that you use for brewing. Your brewing liquor, you should be removing the chlorine or chloramine, depending on what your municipality uses. You should be removing it, because you run into issues with chlorine combining with the phenols and the polyphenols that are in all of our natural ingredients, malt and hops, and producing a chemical called chlorophenol, which tastes like medicine, or it tastes like old-fashioned Band-Aid smells. It's a very avoidable off flavor, and it's unfortunately something that I've experienced in commercial beer. I've cracked open a bottle and poured a liquid Band-Aid into a glass before. It's awful. You can also get moldy, musty, or earthy flavors from municipal water sources, and that's going to be from algae blooms. Say if you have a municipality that pulls from a reservoir, that reservoir is generally going to be slow moving or still, and it's a possibility from fertilizer runoff from farming that you could get an algal bloom, and that can come through in your finished product through your source water. So you want to be filtering. I think a particulate filter would probably take care of a good portion of that flavor. Definitely anything beyond a particulate, a GAC, granulated activated carbon, is going to remove your chloramine and your chlorine for sure. Chloramine is a little trickier. You want to make sure that you ask your municipality which they use and if they ever switch between the two, if they do use one or the other. Reverse osmosis is one of the best ways to get rid of chloramine. Otherwise, you can chemically treat your water as well to get rid of some of the chlorinated products as well. So as you can see here, we have an example of why it's important, in my opinion, to filter your water. So this is a fine particulate filter that goes in our water filter prior to it reaching our reverse osmosis membrane. And this here is the used one. This one is the bright brand new one still in the plastic. And as you can see, that is after a little over a year of use. All that crap would have made it into our final product had we not done this particulate filtration and subsequent reverse osmosis filtration as well. So that's just an example. City water can be good, municipal water can be good. Even if you're on a well of some sort, it can be good. Have it tested, but even with the standards, the EPA standards that these municipality water systems have to follow, this can still make it through. That can make it through. Do you want that in your finished product? I do not. And I would prefer if I were drinking a product that didn't have it in it as well. Granted, like I said, that is about a little over a year of use, so dilution, makes a difference, but I don't want that. So chemical processes can potentially get some off flavors. So caustic or alkaline cleaning solutions, they should be rinsed thoroughly, and your rinse water should be checked until you are familiar with how long it takes to thoroughly rinse your caustic solution out of your closed systems, your fermenters, your bright tanks, your kegs, anything like that, a heat exchanger. Anything like that you use any kind of caustic or alkaline cleaning solutions to clean, you need to get all that chemical residue out. It's a potential hazard. You go back to like a hazard approach. It's a potential hazard in a finished product. We want to prevent that. It's also potential for causing flavor issues. You just don't want it in your beer by any means. So at a minimum, you should at least test the pH of your rinse water every so often, so you get a general idea of how long it takes to rinse your cleaning solution out of your fermenters or any other closed space that you're using. Acid cleaning solutions, same situation. Should also be rinsed thoroughly when you're using it as a cleaning solution. If your acid cleaning solution contains nitric acid, it smells awful. If you have any experience with it, it smells awful. You don't want that anywhere near any of your finished product whatsoever. It smells awful. If you ever get a chance to come up here at Henderson Brewing Company, I'll tell you, I'll show you exactly what I mean. There's no describing it. It's awful. And chlorinated cleaning solutions, same concern with the chlorine-based sanitizer that a municipality uses. You don't want it anywhere near your finished product or it's going to taste like medicine or Band-Aids. I think it's an important habit to have no chlorine around stainless whatsoever, in my opinion. Chlorine cleaners and stainless, they don't get along. I don't want to risk causing any issues to any of my very expensive stainless steel. So we don't use any chlorinated cleaners on any of our tanks or any stainless whatsoever by any means. The only source of chlorine we have back here in this brewery is the chlorine that's in our rinse water, and that's just because we use it straight from our tap, our municipality source. And chemical process continuous sanitizing solutions. We've got a few options. Kind of the industry standard has become peroxyacetic or peracetic acid, or PA, PAA. They all use it to describe the same thing. It will produce a very distinct acetic acid or vinegar smell, even when it is diluted to the appropriate amount. Number one, that's how you know which product you're using. Give it a good smell, you know, hey, this is PA, we're good, because it doesn't. Most of them don't have any colorant, so it's going to be clear. Kind of looks like water. If you accidentally dosed it too high, or if you accidentally have a concentrated, which I don't recommend having concentrated chemicals, never set them down. Always hold them. When you measure them, take them in 2 you're going to dilute them and dump them and rinse that vessel as well. Never set down concentrated chemicals, especially ones that look like water. PA, peroxyacetic acid, is also an oxidizer. So if it's not allowed to drain from your finished products, or if you use it to sanitize a serving vessel like a keg, a can, or a bottle, if you don't allow it to rinse out, drip dry, not dry, but get a lot of that bonus or residual chemical out, it will oxidize your product, and rather quickly as well. It's an effective oxidizer. It works by 2 methods. First of all, by reducing the pH to a level by which the bacteria cannot grow in. Second, by directly oxidizing the cell membrane of the bacteria and killing them through that method. Iodinated or iodine-based solutions like iodophor, they will produce a very distinct chemical medicine iodine flavor if it's not allowed to rinse, or if it's prepared above its no rinse use for sanitizer. If you accidentally mix too much in together, you can get that residual product into your final product. You just don't want that either. Chlorinated solutions, same thing. Like I said, it's probably best practice to stay away from any kind of chlorinated solution in your brewery at all. That way you won't have any issues as far as that goes. Last one I have listed here is acid-based solutions. So one that you might be familiar with is, oh my gosh, it just disappeared. Star San. Star San from 5-Star Chemical Product Company is a blend of phosphoric acid and indodecylbenzene sulfonic acid. So that sanitizer works strictly by reducing pH to the point where the bacteria or wild yeast cannot grow. If it's consumed, or if the pH isn't low enough, if you mix it up incorrectly, it's not going to be that effective. And I don't like foaming products. It foams. They tell you never fear the foam, don't fear the foam. I don't like to deal with foam. I don't want it. So fermentation process and fermentation aids. So the first one is going to be yeast nutrient. So what this does is it provides essential sources of FAN or YAN. That's going to be free amino nitrogen or yeast available nitrogen. However you see it written, they mean the same thing. It's a source of nitrogen for the yeast to incorporate in their growth process. And it also contains micronutrients, and they're also usually made from hydrolyzed or lyophilized yeast. So these yeast are basically cannibalizing themselves. Some can have a very distinct smell when you go to use them in your process, whether it's in the boil or adding to the boil, after the boil, whatever. I recommend boiling, that's where it's sterile. But because it is a rich source of nitrogen, it has a very distinct smell, and it reminds me of cat urine, but it is just rich urea nitrogen. Ooh, kicks you right in the schnoz. If used in appropriate doses, if you're not going way above the recommended maximum, you're not going to have any issue, because the yeast is going to incorporate all of it and metabolize all of it, and it's a good thing, even though it smells like crap going into your fermenter. Because it allows for, number one, a healthy fermentation and reducing the likelihood of unwanted ester production. We use yeast nutrient in everything, no matter if we want esters to be produced, like in a Hefeweizen or in E-Belgian. Yeast nutrient is necessary. It reduces the likelihood of producing unwanted flavors. Because remember, sometimes it's about what you're not smelling or what you're not tasting. Fining agents, not likely to directly cause any kind of flavor, but indirectly by, number one, reducing yeast concentration, yeast suspension, and number two, reducing some proteins and some other potential flavor active macromolecules as well. They will help drop those out of suspension and thereby changing the flavor of your finished product by reducing, number one, like I said, the yeast load, the yeast in suspension. Because if you ever had a yeasty pour of a beer that's not intended to be a yeasty pour, it's very distracting and just really off-putting. We have some examples: gelatin, isinglass, and silicatic acid or silicon-based products. For those interested in keeping a animal-free or potentially vegetarian or vegan-friendly product, the first two are products of animal byproduct. Basically, gelatin is in the collagen of animal skin, animal hides, most likely pork. In most situations, isinglass is from the swim bladder of fish. So keep that in mind when choosing a fining agent. One I didn't mention here is Whirlfloc that goes into boil. These are going to be post-fermentation aids. Whirlfloc goes into boil. It is a product made from Irish moss. You might even use Irish moss, which is plant-based material. And a lot of these things, what they are is positively charged product that bind to the negatively charged cell membranes of yeast and basically cause them to flocculate and drop out of suspension. So heating methods, a lot of people might not think about it as a potential, I don't even want to say off flavor, a potential source of flavor. And the method by which you heat can make a difference in that as well. So they're all going to have beneficial caramelization and Maillard reactions. And we'll talk about that in the malt-based lecture as well. But electric heating, there is a potential for scorching if your electric elements are too dense in their wattage. So it depends on how long your electric element is. They're usually going to loop back on themselves and then fold over. So the longer your electric element is, the less dense your wattage is, less likely to cause scorching. Direct fire, that's like your propane, heating the bottom of the pot. There's always a potential for scorching, and that is dependent upon the thickness of your vessel, where that flame comes into contact with it. The thicker that vessel is at that point, the less likelihood of scorching that you're going to have. Think of it as if you're cooking on a stock pot at home. A thin-walled stock pot, you're going to get a lot of your stuff, a lot of your food stuck, scorched, cooked to the bottom of that pot. The thicker the bottom of that pot is, the more gentle that heating occurs, the more gently that heating occurs, and the less likely you're going to get scorching and things sticking to the bottom of your pot. Steam could be similar to direct fire, but it's still not nearly as hot. You think about the difference between a flame directly touching that metal versus steam, which steam can be in the range, 300 to 500 degrees, depending on your particular setup. Probably not that hot, but it's hot. But it is a very gentle heating and very efficient source of heat, and is the least likely, in my opinion, to cause scorching. And Those are all going to be methods of heating a boil. If your system heats the mash, you want that to be as gentle as possible. There is always a possibility of extracting tannins or polyphenols from the grain husks. Pardon me. Now that is more dependent upon the pH of the solution that you're dealing with than it is the temperature, because we're already dealing with temperatures that are hot enough to extract the tannins. What we have going in favor of us as brewers is the pH. The farther you get from 7 or 8, the less likely you're going to be to extract tannins and get that astringent tea-like dryness, or just harsh bitterness, dryness that astringency can cause. A really strong tea is just awful. Take a drink and you're somehow thirstier. Maybe that's a good thing for beer, I don't know. Probably not. It's not good. It's bad. You want to keep your pH in your mash as low as possible within normal range. And your strike water is important as well. If your strike water is straight municipal water, you want to try to pre-acidify it if you can, to help prevent the extraction of tannins when you're dumping 170 degree water right on top of that mash bed. You want that pH to be under 7 at a minimum. As you can see here, an example of electric heating elements. This is a stock photo from Henderson Brewing Company. I believe I took this about 3 weeks ago or so. As you can see here, we have 4 elements. The 4th one is covered, the 3rd one's partially covered. It's coming out here, it's coming down, looping around on itself, looping around again, looping and coming back. So our wattage density is rather low. These are 6,000 watt elements each, and they are 2.5 feet long. So I'm going to do the math in my head, but it's relatively low wattage density for electric elements. The shorter or smaller your elements are, the more dense your wattage density is, the more likely you're going to get some scorching. And this is an example of a calandria, which is the source of steam heat. And we might get to see one when we go and check out Kate's. I don't know if she has a calandria like this or if it's a steam jacketed kettle. Here, then we get to the fun yippity-doo part, infection-based flavors. Everything we want to do to avoid this, unless you're doing specific sours or wild fermentation. So, first source we're going to look at is bacterial. And lactobacillus species, they will produce lactic acid or lactate and acetic acid or acetate during its fermentation. The Lactobacillus brevis is going to be the most common spoilage bacteria in breweries. The advantage that we have as brewers is it only takes about 3 to 5 IBUs of bittering to inhibit the growth of these Lactobacillus bacteria. That's the advantage. Now, the issue there is when you get in a very lowly bittered beers, or if you're running into issues with mash. For the most part, we're not going to have a problem, but the potential always exists. Pediococcus species produce lactate during its fermentation. Pediococcus is a very high source of potential issues because it is something that lives on our skin. It is ubiquitous all over our bodies. So if you're touching or coming in contact with a finished product, number one, avoid it. You shouldn't be, except dry hopping, which the hops are probably going to cause some deleterious effects against the Pediococcus anyway. But if you're going to be doing something like that, put on some gloves, soak your hands in sanitizer, do whatever you need to do. Try to prevent your hands from touching finished beer. I never recommend doing this in a fermenter as well. Acetobacter species, they produce a significant amount of acetic acid. However, only in the presence of oxygen. So, as I've got written here, Acetobacter is ubiquitous in the air. Like, no matter what, you've got an air system feeding heat and cooling to your brewery, you're going to have Acetobacter in the air. The advantage is they only cause issues in the presence of oxygen. Wort is only oxygenated for a very short amount of time before we throw a ton of yeast in there. And what the yeast does is basically outcompetes Acetobacter for all of that oxygen and all that potential nutrient. By the time the yeast are done with it, before the Acetobacter would ever have a chance to get to work on it, there's no oxygen left, there's not much sugar left. We've outcompeted Acetobacter. But if for some reason you have a delayed pitching, you're double batching, you're brewing in one day, issues arise, you got to brew in the next day, make sure that you had the most careful. Do not open that fermenter for any reason whatsoever. Anytime you need to open for piping, to hook a hose up, spray the crap out of it with your sanitizer or whatever you got around to keep any potential Acetobacter from getting there. Enterobacteriaceae family produce DMS and diethyl sulfide, things very similar as far as that goes, vegetables, cooked corn, that kind of stuff. Enterobacter might look familiar. Enterobacter come from the gut. The most common form of food poisoning, well, the most common form of contamination of food is, I'll do this in a professional manner, anus to mouth. And that is from not washing your hands after going to the bathroom, touching something that somebody else touched after not washing their hands after going to the bathroom. E. coli, one of the most common food spoiling bacteria, Enterobacteriaceae, caused by poop. Wash your hands. Wash your hands. Clostridium species produce butyric acid contamination. Clostridium species are ubiquitous. You go out, scoop up a handful of dirt, it's going to be loaded with Clostridium bacteria and Clostridium spores. Not a good idea to put dirt in your beer. I don't recommend it. But the interesting thing, butyric acid is described as baby vomit, or just vomit in general. You don't recognize it until you've had a sample, and I'm sure eventually we'll get to the point where we can have maybe some spiked beer with flavor samples and we can experience this. I've experienced it twice. Number one, when I opened up our flavor capsules and did a tasting here at the brewery with our employees as a sensory learning exercise. Number two, on a heavily fruited sour from a commercial brewery. They put it out and it was a butyric bomb. And it literally tasted like liquid vomit, liquid baby vomit. And just, I don't understand how that ever made it past anybody that is quality minded at that brewery. And maybe they don't have anybody quality minded at that brewery, and maybe that's the problem. But you throw out a vomit bomb like that, you're going to get a bad reputation. Sanitize, wash your hands. Then we run into wild yeast, and wild yeast also can be pretty well ubiquitous, not nearly as much as some of the other ones. But they're also potentially airborne as well, and if you're doing any grain handling near your fermenters, you want to be very careful of cleaning everything. So Brettanomyces is kind of the more popular of the wild yeasts, so much so that it has become kind of one of the standards for a wild fermentation, producing wild sours. Sometimes, like I have here, it's sometimes deliberate. People will pitch Brettanomyces either alone by itself, or they'll co-pitch with Saccharomyces. And Brettanomyces is a slow, it's really a slow burn yeast, and it will consume sugars that Saccharomyces doesn't or can't. So if you co-pitch, you're going to get the main fermentation with your Saccharomyces characteristics. The Brettanomyces will take over after that, and a year later you'll have something interesting. So it can produce 4-ethyl phenol, and that's where you get the barnyard, horse blanket, straw. People love that for some reason. I can do about 1 a year. That's about my limit. And you'll also get the caprylic, caproic, or capric acids, and that's where you're going to get goaty or sweaty, or also sweaty cheese a little bit as well. Again, some people love it, and if done in a very balanced and restrained way, it can be interesting. Like I said, maybe 1 a year, if that. It'll also produce a fair amount of acid, and it will sour the finished product as well. And here we have an example of a pellicle. Could be yeast or bacterial in nature. There's no way to tell what who made that pellicle unless you look at it under a microscope, and then all you'll be able to tell is whether or not it's yeast or bacterial. You're not going to be able to tell, oh yeah, that's Brettanomyces. No, it's going to look like yeast. Brettanomyces kind of looks like a brick rather than an ovoid shape like Saccharomyces. But some of the other wild yeasts also look like bricks. So the best you can do is, if it's pellicle, maybe take a sample, look at it under a microscope, see if it's yeast or if it's bacterial in nature. That'll give you an idea of possibly where it came from, how it happened, how to treat it if you want to try to save the beer. I have heard people saying you can rack from underneath of that, just make sure none of that gets into your finished product. Seems risky to me. I would rather potentially save any negative impacts on the brand, on the downstream. Or, you know what, put that somewhere in a barrel somewhere and let it ride, come back to it. It might be good, it might not be. But get it out of your stainless, clean your stainless really well, really hot caustic. Best you can do, run it for longer than what you normally would. Blast it with sanitizer, make sure it doesn't go anywhere near any of your finished products from that point on. You crack open your fermenter, put some dry hops in. If you see that, that's not a good day. So, special process flavors. Didn't really know what to call these, so we're calling them special process flavors. So barrel aging is obviously popular. Barrel aging, whether it be virgin barrels or dumped spirit barrels, can add all kinds of wonderful flavors if you enjoy them. Virgin barrels, you're going to get that oak or whatever the wood is used to make that barrel. You're going to get those microchemicals, vanillin, cinnamon, cinnamol. Very interesting flavors from the wood. Dumped spirits barrels, you're going to get everything that spirit left behind. Assuming it's freshly dumped, the longer that barrel sits, the less spirit character you're going to get from that barrel, and the more possibility that those staves are going to shrink and it's not going to be able to hold any kind of liquid. But can definitely change a product significantly. You take a stout, you take a drink, it tastes like a stout, you put it in a barrel, all of a sudden you've got a range of potential different flavors. And coincide that with time, those flavors are going to change. If you take a stout that was aged in a barrel for 2 months, it's going to be heavy on that spirit that was in there prior. You age it out a year or so, it's going to mellow, it's going to settle, and you're going to get more complex flavors rather than just, if it was a bourbon barrel, it's not going to be slappy in the face bourbon. It's going to be bourbon with a lot of the undertones of what comes from that bourbon and what comes from that wood. And wood aging. So there are probably a lot more than 3, but the 3 main things you're going to get from wood are going to be lignin, tannin, or lactones. Lignin is responsible for the vanilla bean flavor, along with vanillin, a couple other chemicals that taste or compromise up the essential oil from vanilla bean. And lactones are going to be like a coconut. So when you get a bourbon or a spirit or something like that that has hints of coconut, it's going to be from the lactones. And then of course tannin, we all know what tannin tastes like kind of a little astringent, a little drying. Complementary to any of the wood